Now, in ancient times, Israel or Judea had its own government. So there would be a government again of Israel. And the scriptures speak of this. There's a prophecy that says when Israel comes back into the world, when they are gathered back, it says, David shall be their king. Now, David is ultimately a way of speaking of Messiah, the son of David, because this is long after David was alive. But interesting, something more, because when the Jewish people returned to Israel, and Israel became a nation, when it was resurrected from the dead, its first leader, founder, was a man named David Ben-Gurion. That's a picture. That's him. Some of you have seen him before. Some of you know of him. Very crucial person. He was the first leader of Israel. He is called the founder. You have Herzl was the visionary. David Ben-Gurion was the first leader there. He was not born David Ben-Gurion. He was born David Grun. In 1886, in a city in Poland called Plonsk, but it was under Russian rule at the time, both his father and his grandfather were Zionists. They believed in the return of the Jewish people. He learned to read Hebrew as a child. His grandfather taught him. His father, Avigdor Grun, was a leader in a movement that supported the return to Israel. When he was around 11 years old, a man visited his city, little city, Plonsk. The man was tall, had long black hair. The man was Theodor Herzl. He came to the small city of Plonsk to share the message of return, Jewish people, return to the land of Israel. The people there greeted Herzl as the Messiah. Some of them, they thought he was. Little David, was a pale Jewish boy in a long black gown in the synagogue of Plonsk when he heard the report that the Messiah came. Now, Ben-Gurion would recall, he said, one glimpse of this man. He says, and I was ready to follow him then and there to the land of my ancestors. Herzl could have no idea if Herzl would die at 44, his life was over a few years later. Herzl would have no idea that a little boy in that city would one day become the leader of the nation that he envisioned, of the resurrected nation. Around that same time, Ben-Gurion's mother died, causing a long, deep sorrow. But when he was about 14, he and two friends formed a youth club called Ezra, based on the Jewish priest Ezra, who was linked to the return, the restoration of the Jewish people from the first exile, the Babylonian exile, in the days of the return. He said there seemed to be a link between Ezra's mission and our own newly born hope of Palestine. So it was there, this is 14 years old, to promote Hebrew studies and return to the Holy Land. 1906, around the age of 20, Ben-Gurion departs from Poland or Russia, and he comes to Israel, or it was called Palestine at the time because of the Romans when they tried to wipe out the name of Israel. When he came there, now keep in mind, the rulers of Israel are Muslim at the time, the Ottoman Turkish Empire. There's no way they're going to let any Jewish state come into existence except God had other plans, and World War I comes and everything changes. But he comes there under Ottoman rule. He gets a job working on a farm for the next few years, like a kibbutz. The land was under that control. Now, but Jewish people are returning even though it's under the Islamic Empire. 1909, he pays his first visit to Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion was not religious, but he was so overcome by the sight of the Western Wall that he couldn't leave this city for a week. He described it as a meeting of a son meeting his very long-lost father. Around 1910, Ben-Gurion moves to Jerusalem to work for a friend who invited him. He was kind of reluctant to work on a journal, a newspaper, a Zionist newspaper saying return. So he accepted it, and at that time he adopted a pen name. The pen name, his name was David Grun. So what they would do when they came back to Israel, they'd find a Hebrew name that was similar to their other name, to the name they had in the nations, and they took a new identity. So he got Grun. He from there he got Gurion. It's very similar in Hebrew. It's just almost similar letters, consonants. Grun becomes Gurion, he becomes Ben-Gurion. 1910. He begins to study law. 1914, the World War I breaks out. The Ottoman authorities deport him to Egypt. From there, he goes to the U.S., United States. He lives in America for 3 years in, I believe, New York City. And there I think he meets his wife and he gets married. 1917, the year of that Jubilee, if you remember, comes the Balfour Declaration. Britain says, we are going to give the land back to the original people. Israel will be a Jewish homeland. They declare it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean anything because they don't have the land until a month later or so, General Allenby, remember, year of Jubilee comes into Jerusalem, and Israel, for the first time, is in the hands of a people who say, we want to give this back to you. Okay, so that goes. When that all happens, as it's happening, Ben-Gurion rushes home to Israel. And he joins the Jewish Legion. Remember I told you about that Irish Christian who formed the first fighting force of Jewish people in 2,000 years in the land? Well, Ben-Gurion becomes one of the soldiers, or he joins for a time. After the war, Ben-Gurion returns permanently to live in Israel. Now it's under British rule, British mandate. That's an early picture of him. 1919, he becomes one of the leaders of the labor Zionist movement. Then he becomes the General Secretary of the Zionist Labor Federation from 1921 to 1935. 1935, he emerges as the leader of the Jewish community in Israel. Very unlikely that this little boy and this whole thing happens, and now he becomes the main leader of the returned exiles in Israel. 1939, the British Empire issues the white paper restricting the number of Jewish people to almost nothing, just when they need it, all the more because Hitler is planning to wipe them out, and the British stop them there. That's the same time, if you remember, Harry Truman, the last message, he condemns this right out in Congress. Right after that, he's the one who speaks for Israel. Later on, God will make him president at the exact time when Israel will need that. So, Ben-Gurion says, listen, we'll fight with the British against the Nazis. We'll fight as if there's no white paper, but we'll fight the white paper as if there's no war. So here now he's focusing because he's believing that after the war that there will be a Jewish nation. And even though Britain is kind of backed out and they don't want to do it anymore, they are now afraid of losing Arab support, so they start turning against the Jewish people. And God, at that point, says, okay, that's about the end of the British Empire. And then he raises America. That's how God works here. Now, so Ben-Gurion focuses on raising a Jewish army. Now, the British finally after the war, are so fed up that they say, we can't take it anymore. We're getting out of here. We're giving it to the United Nations. You do whatever you want. But they don't want Israel. But that means Israel, suddenly the British are going to go, and all of a sudden it's going to be Israel and all the Arab nations that have now sworn, we're going to wipe it out as soon as it's born. We're going to wipe it out. So now Ben-Gurion tries to quickly put together an army. And so he's now going to lead its military operations. Now there was an arms embargo. He works on smuggling arms from anywhere they could. They just smuggled arms and try to train people quick who had never fought in their lives. And so they form this provisional kind of army. They get everybody they can, man, woman, everybody, and people who don't know how to fight. On May 14th, the day comes, 1948. I already told you about the UN vote. That was 1947. May 14th, 1948, the British mandate expires at midnight. Ben-Gurion, there's now a stocky man with a halo of white hair, older now, stands in front of a clusters of microphones. That's the exact place. It's happening right there. That is a prophetic moment in front of the picture of the man he had seen as a small boy and read from the paper the declaration of the rebirth of the nation of Israel. He announces it to the world. Israel would be reborn as all the prophets said, as God said, end times, I will do it. Now it happens. At the stroke of midnight, the mandate is over. The declaration goes into effect. Harry Truman, the modern day Cyrus, he issues America's recognition of the newborn nation 11 minutes after midnight, so America becomes the first nation to recognize Israel. The armies at the same moment, the armies of the Arab nations, 5 different nations come and invade Israel to wipe it out at that moment. Israel is outnumbered, outgunned, outtrained, out everything. Miraculously, they survive. They actually win. David Ben-Gurion is then elected the nation's first prime minister. The little boy who caught a glimpse of Theodore Herzl is now the first leader of what Herzl envisioned years and years before. With a short exception, he would serve as prime minister until 1963. He'd be the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history, a record that will only be broken this summer with Benjamin Netanyahu. Ben-Gurion would live to see the return of Israel's ancient capital, Jerusalem, in the Six-Day War. He would retire from politics, but he would live out his last days in a humble home in a kibbutz in the desert. He dies in the year 1973 at the age of 87. Throughout the land of Israel, there are places named after Ben-Gurion. Whenever you fly to Israel, those who will be coming to Israel, you land at Ben-Gurion Airport. He was a beloved figure called the founder of modern Israel, or the father of modern Israel. Ben-Gurion would meet Harry Truman more than once. Once to present him a gift, which he did, and later to tell Truman that he would be remembered throughout Jewish history for the ages for what he did, at which point Truman, this is the second time, another time I told you about the rabbi who told him he was Cyrus, but now Truman is so overcome, Ben-Gurion said he couldn't move, he was so overcome with emotion. But we saw that behind Truman was the mystery of Cyrus. Could there be a mystery behind Israel's first leader? Now, what I'm going to share, I had no idea of any of this, and I didn't even know the name, that there's something here now. Ben-Gurion was the first leader of the resurrected nation of Israel. But what about the last leader, or at the end when Israel was destroyed? See, if God is resurrecting what was, and he's resurrecting the soldiers and the farmers and all, could this also link to the leader of the resurrected nation? Before Israel was destroyed, as they did, Judea had revolted against the Roman Empire to break free of Rome. They formed a provisional government, revolutionary provisional government of its leaders to guide the nation. This would be the last leaders of the unified nation before its destruction. There was a religious leader, but then there was the main secular leader who would be revered for ages to come as a hero and as a martyr. What was the name of Israel's last leader in that provisional government? His name was Ben-Gurion. I had no idea. In the last days of Israel, its last leader was called Ben-Gurion. And in the first days of the resurrected Israel, its first leader is called Ben-Gurion. So the nation that was resurrected from ancient times has a leader who is walking in the resurrection of that other leader. How did that happen? Ben-Gurion simply did what many Israelis did. He chose a name that sounded like his name, Gurion. So he became Gurion, and he had awareness that there was a guy back then. But here's a guy, he's like a young man who's just now become an editor of a little journal. What are the chances that this guy with that name is going to become the leader? By a multitude of twists and turns of events, nearly 40 years after he made that decision to get that pen name, he becomes the leader of the resurrected nation. And it became his name. The ancient Ben-Gurion was appointed leader in Jerusalem. The modern Ben-Gurion becomes Ben-Gurion when he comes to Jerusalem.
To find out how you can receive more of Jonathan's teachings, to receive special free gifts, or get in touch, go to hopeoftheworld.org or call toll-free 1-800-YESHUA-1. That's hopeoftheworld.org or call 1-800-YESHUA-1. That's 1-800-937-4821. You can also get more at Jonathan Cahn's Facebook page or write us direct at Hope of the World, Box 1111, Lodi, New Jersey 07644, USA.